Never before in history, America's inspired birth. Unit 3, Chapter 10, Separation of Church and State. The American colonies declared independence from England in 1776. That event marked the start of a great upheaval in America's social order. First, there was the military war with England, fought with muskets, guns, and cannons. Perhaps even more significant, however, was the contest of ideas that took place simultaneously. That contest took place among the Americans themselves. The outcome was a new social order called the United States of America. The founders finished their work in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was added to the United States Constitution. In 15 short years, they had devised a new kind of nation, the likes of which had never been seen. One distinctive of the new nation was its emphasis on religious liberty and separation of church and state. For previous generations and even centuries, people throughout Europe had tried to achieve religious freedom. At best, they succeeded only in part. The Americans were successful, however. How they did it is an intriguing subject. What was special about the American experience that enabled the founders to succeed where Europe had failed? How were American ideas different? What role did religion play in bringing about the new social order? What did the founders mean by religious liberty and separation of church and state? In defining these terms, did the founders draw from Christian principles and ideas? This chapter addresses these questions. 10.1 The Religious Climate in Colonial Virginia. From 1607 to 1776, Virginia was an English colony. In England, the government controlled religion. There was no such thing as full religious liberty or separation of church and state. Virginia was not alone in wrestling with the questions of religious liberty, separation of church and state, and religious taxes and assessments. The contest over religious liberty had been going on ever since the first settlers landed in America in the early 1600s. In Virginia, the contest primarily involved Anglicans, Baptists, and Presbyterians. In other colonies, it involved Puritans, Quakers, Lutherans, Mennonites, Catholics, and many other groups as well. Trade, travel, and communication between the colonies meant that there were many shared ideas between Virginians and New Englanders. Puritans, Presbyterians, Quakers, and Baptists would often borrow each other's best arguments, where such arguments did not clash with their own core beliefs. These shared ideas welded the American colonies into one people. They also eroded the barriers between the various religious groups. As one of England's colonies, Virginia was directly controlled by the king. The king was in charge of the civil government and was also in charge of the church. The king had established the Anglican Church as the official government-supported church for the colony. Because the church was supported through tax money, all Virginia taxpayers were forced to support the Anglican Church, whether they were members of that church or not. English kings demanded to be honored as God's chosen instruments and often used force to get their way. They claimed to rule by divine right, meaning that they were God's direct representatives on earth. They could imprison, torture, and even execute people who disagreed with the government's view of right religion. From time to time, the king and parliament granted toleration to religious groups who were not Anglicans. This was particularly true after 1688, when William and Mary took the throne in England as a result of the Glorious Revolution. They promised to be more lenient in the area of religion than previous monarchs had been. In 1689, England passed a law declaring that several persecuted religious groups would now be tolerated by the English government. Even in the very concept of toleration, however, there was an implied threat. The government could withdraw such toleration at any time. Although religious toleration diminished persecution, the state still dominated the church. They were not really separate. Consequently, even though many religious denominations thrived in Virginia, they were never truly free. They existed by government's permission and grace. As late as 1774, no Baptist minister could preach in Virginia unless the colonial legislature granted him a license. 10.2 Madison and Jefferson. Amidst this backdrop, two very important Virginians were born and raised, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. After being involved with the relation between church and state in Virginia, they greatly influenced how the same issues were handled later at the national level. They honored their arguments and perfected their theories in Virginia before taking them to the national stage. Thus, the contest in Virginia for religious liberty prefigures the larger struggle for religious liberty in the founding of the United States. As a young man, Madison had determined to become a minister. He had the words of the Westminster Confession memorized at a very early age. He attended the College of New Jersey, Princeton, intending to be ordained a minister of the gospel. Madison's principal philosophical influence came from John Witherspoon, Madison's professor at Princeton. Witherspoon was an ordained Calvinist minister with very traditional Christian views. Witherspoon also strongly supported religious liberty. Arguing from the Westminster Confession that other Puritan sources, Witherspoon convinced Madison that the only correct principle on which to establish a Christian republic was liberty of conscience. During his studies at Princeton, Madison reconsidered his professional goals and decided to put his energy toward a legal profession rather than the ministry. He felt he could serve the nation better in that forum. Nevertheless, his religious training continued to permeate all of his work. James Smiley was convincingly argued that Witherspoon's Calvinism was the source of Madison's political presuppositions. Madison's place in the founding of the United States is central. Madison was one of the main architects of the United States Constitution. His work earned him the title Father of the Constitution. To complete the Constitution, a Bill of Rights was added in 1791. The Bill of Rights contained 10 amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment declared Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Madison was one of the principal writers of the First Amendment, the source of our present religious liberties. Jefferson's contribution to America's founding and to religious liberty was no less important than Madison's. Jefferson himself regarded his writings on religious liberty as among the 3 most important achievements. When he wrote his epitaph, he judged his Statute for Religious Liberty a higher achievement than his founding of the University of Virginia. Only one thing did he place above his Statute for Religious Liberty: his authoring of the Declaration of Independence. Besides being the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson is widely regarded as the official interpreter of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. The phrase separation of church and state can be traced to Jefferson. It is in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association that Jefferson said, "The First Amendment erected a wall of separation between church and state." Jefferson was particularly fond of Baptists. He assured his Baptist friends in Connecticut that the First Amendment stopped the federal government from interfering with religion. Jefferson's phrase, wall of separation, has been cited ever since as being fundamental to understanding the First Amendment. Jefferson, however, did not establish this principle to contain religion. Instead, he believed, as did John Milton and John Locke, that true religion flourishes best when the civil authorities practice a hands-off policy. In taking this position, Jefferson and the other founders were not discarding Christian views in favor of Enlightenment views. As previous chapters have shown, the legal theory used by the founders derived from Christianity. Moreover, it was already at least 600 years old at the time of the founding. Its principles had been a permanent fixture for centuries in the writings of the English common law. In practical terms, it makes no difference whether the founders learned their ideas about law and rights in church, or whether they learned them from studying law books or the books of political philosophers. We are dealing here with a question of roots. It is fair to conclude that in fundamentally important ways, their basic view of law and rights arose in large part from the direct impact of Western Christianity. 10.3 The Virginia Bill of Rights. In May of 1776, in a time of great crisis, Virginia's colonial representatives met at Williamsburg. The King of England had already leveled the city of Norfolk, Virginia, with naval artillery. The colonists had also learned that the king intended further military action against them. He was waging war on his own subjects and had declared them outside of his protection. As a result, the Virginia representatives declared that Virginia was no longer a colony of England, but was now an independent state. On June 12, 1776, they published the first part of the new state constitution. It was a Bill of Rights consisting of 16 articles. The rest of the state's constitution, which defined the powers and structure of Virginia's new government, was completed about a month later. A number of Virginia leaders, including George Mason, Patrick Henry, and James Madison, helped draft the Virginia Bill of Rights. Section 16 struck directly at the British practice of merging church and state. It reads, Section 16, that religion or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. And that is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. Section 16 completely reversed the centuries-old British practice of government control of religion. It proclaimed that religion is outside the power of government. The Virginia Constitution made religion a matter between an individual and God. According to Section 16, religion is a matter of reason and conviction, meaning that religion is a matter of the heart and mind. Section 16 proclaimed that the authority of civil government extends only to outward deeds, and then only if those deeds are harmful. Civil government has no authority over ideas or beliefs. It cannot punish people for what is in their hearts and minds. It can only punish bad deeds and harmful conduct. Section 16 insisted that religion and its practices were outside the scope of government power. 10.4 Taxes and the use of force. Government use force to collect unpaid taxes. A tax is only as effective as the government's authority to use force to collect it. In colonial Virginia, taxes funded the Anglican Church. When Baptists, Presbyterians, or other religious people in Virginia refused to pay those taxes, they encountered governmental force and violence. But Section 16 said that governmental force and violence had no place in religious matters. This meant that government had no right to impose such taxes. If Virginia was going to be free of religious coercion, the church in Virginia had to be independent from the state. New laws were therefore needed to implement the changes called for by Section 16. When the Virginia legislature convened in October of 1776, it was overwhelmed by the size of its task. All the old laws were colonial laws, which had to be revised now that Virginia was a state rather than a colony. In particular, although the new Constitution provided for religious liberty, the old laws did not. The legislators were faced with a grim fact. Every able-bodied man was needed to fight the British. This included Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, and others, all of which were treated as second-class citizens under the old laws. The time was right to make everyone equal, since they would all be fighting a common enemy. Consequently, the legislature canceled every law that renders criminal the maintaining any opinion in matter of religion, or the exercising any mode of worship different from the Anglican Church. The legislature also exempted dissenting churches and individuals from paying taxes or assessments that funded the Anglican Church. This was not the end of the tax issue, however. The convention that drafted Virginia's Constitution was not the ordinary legislature. Technically, the two bodies were separate. The Constitutional Convention was elected mainly by dissenters, voters who were mostly Baptists, Presbyterians, and others opposed to the state church. The members of the legislature, on the other hand, were mostly Anglicans, who had strong ties to the old regime. Many in the legislature were not yet ready to discard the British approach. Despite the language of Virginia's Constitution, the legislature hesitated to implement the new principles. They refused to do away with the state-established church. Moreover, they were ready to pay new taxes to fund their preferred religious causes as soon as the war crisis eased. Between 1777 and 1779, debate raged throughout Virginia over taxation and the state-established church. Edmund Pendleton and Robert Carter Nicholas were staunch Anglicans and politically powerful legislators. They wanted to keep the established church and raise new taxes for it. The majority of the voters, however, wanted an end to the merger of church and state, and thus an end to religious tax. 10.5 Jefferson's Statue for Religious Liberty. In 1779, when Thomas Jefferson was elected governor of Virginia, he decided to use his position to force the issue of religious liberty with the legislature. He therefore wrote a bill promoting religious liberty, the Statue for Religious Liberty. This was the statue note on Jefferson's grave as second of the three most important achievements in his life. He introduced it into the legislature through a friendly delegate named John Harvey, who was from Jefferson's home county of Albemarle. The Statute for Religious Liberty provided concrete means for enforcing Section 16 of the Virginia Bill of Rights. It would establish religious liberty and de-establish the Anglican Church. It would outlaw religious taxes and assessments. The bill sparked intense debate and did not become law in Virginia until 1786, nearly 10 years after the Virginia Constitution called for separation of church and state. Jefferson wrote the bill in 1779, only 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, while the war with England was still underway. Jefferson's bill brought the issue of religious liberty to the forefront of Virginia politics. If the bill became law, it would mandate religious liberty for every person in Virginia. It would stop the government from interfering with religion, and it would forbid state-sponsored churches funded with tax money. The law would give teeth to Virginia's new Constitution, which declared religious liberty an inalienable right, beyond the reach of government. Jefferson's Bill of Religious Liberty is just as remarkable as Section 16 of the Virginia Bill of Rights. Both bills rejected the British and medieval approaches to religion that combined church and state, instead drawing from the stream of Christian thought that included English common law and the Protestant Reformation. These bills stressed the Creator-Redeemer distinction, as well as the liberty of conscience inherent in this distinction. Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, 1786, Thomas Jefferson. 1. Well aware that Almighty God has created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal civil punishments or burdens or by civil incapacitations, lack of fitness for office, tend only to produce habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who, being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to spread it by coercion or force on either, as was in his almighty power to do. That the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, religious, who, being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion rule over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible ones, and such endeavoring to impose them on others, have established and maintained false religion over the greatest part of the world and through all time. That to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he believes is sinful and tyrannical. That even forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor whose morals he would make his pattern and whose powers he feels most persuasive to righteousness. That our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than on our opinions in physics or geometry. That therefore the proscribing of any citizen as unworthy of the public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to office of trust and emolument unless he profess and renounce this or that religious opinion is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right. That to suffer the civil magistrate to introduce his powers into the field of opinion, and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency, is a dangerous fallacy, which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he, the magistrate, being of course judge of that tendency, will make his opinions the rule of judgment, and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only, as they shall square with, or differ from, his own. That it is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere with principles, break out into overt, open or public acts against peace and good order, and finally, that truth is great, and will prevail if left to herself, that she's the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and that nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, for errors cease to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. Number 2. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain, their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And number 3, and though we well know that this assembly elected by the people, for the ordinary purpose of legislation only, has no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies constituted with powers equal to her own, that therefore to declare this act to be irrevocable would be of no effect in law, yet, as we are free to declare, and do declare, that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any acts shall hereafter be passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement, violation of natural rights. 10.6 The Baptist Influence on Jefferson. In Albemarle County, where Jefferson lived, many of his voting neighbors were Baptists or other opponents of religious establishment. Like them, Jefferson, too, was a dissenter. His personal religious views differed from those supported by the government. Jefferson spent much of his time conferring with Baptist leaders to hear their views about separation of church and state. He became familiar with the Baptist struggle for religious liberty, which had been going on for over a century. Where religious liberty was concerned, he adopted both their arguments and their biblical citations as his own. In 1776, Jefferson was a member of the Committee on Religion in the House of Delegates. It was his job to review the hundreds of petitions and memorials that flooded in from all over Virginia. These came primarily from Baptist and Presbyterian churches, religious associations, and individuals who opposed the government's control of religion. Despite a busy schedule, it appears that Jefferson not only read many of these petitions, but also met with representatives from various counties who explained their petitions to him. When Jefferson was in Philadelphia in 1776, the famed Baptist activist from Massachusetts, Isaac Buckus, placed his views on church-state separation before the entire Continental Congress. Like Virginia, Massachusetts, and the rest of the colonies were still working to solve the tough questions about what the right approach to church and state should be. In 1777, the Baptist General Association began drafting a religious liberty law. They submitted their work to Jefferson and Madison from 1777 to 1779. Jefferson conferred with the Baptists on this matter. One of the Baptist leaders was Jeremiah Walker. He was the clerk for the Baptist General Association and was the association's delegate from Goochland County to the Virginia legislature. As soon as Jefferson's bill was made public in 1779, the Baptist General Association voted its full support for the measure. Their views and Jefferson's coincided, as did their reasons and arguments. In essence, Jefferson's bill simply framed the Baptist approach to church-state relations in legal language. The Baptists unanimously opposed merging state and church. Their petitions and memorials used arguments that were virtually identical to the ones used by Jefferson in his bill for religious liberty. Virginia Presbyterians who supported religious liberty used similar arguments. It is from these Baptist and Presbyterian petitions that Jefferson derived the framework of his argument. Although Jefferson authored Virginia's laws regarding religious liberty, it was the Baptists and Presbyterians who provided the underlying theory and inspiration. 10.7 What Jefferson said. In the bill's preamble, Jefferson began by saying that Almighty God hath created the mind free. He started with the premise that God is the creator, and since the creator made the mind free, the mind is not under the state's control. If government uses force to coerce people's minds, it is a departure from the plane of the holy author of our religion, who, being Lord both of the body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was his almighty power to do. There is no question to whom Jefferson is referring here. He is speaking of Jesus of Nazareth, who during his earthly ministry refused to force people to follow him. Jefferson calls him the holy author of our religion, the Lord both of body and mind, and Almighty. These are not the descriptions of an ordinary mortal. The preamble deliberately refers to Jesus in standard Christian terms, setting him apart from ordinary men and identifying him as the divine Redeemer. How was Jesus relevant to Jefferson's view of religious liberty? Given Jefferson's familiarity with Baptist and Presbyterian thinking on this issue, he may have had a specific incident in mind from the life of Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, When Jesus was rejected in a certain village, his disciples asked whether they should call down fire from heaven to punish the villagers. Jesus rebuked his disciples for even thinking that way, telling them that they had the wrong spirit. Jesus explained that he did not come to destroy, but to save people. Whether Jefferson had that specific incident in mind or not, throughout the bill, he tactfully commends Jesus for never forcing people to believe the gospel. Jesus' example sets the standard of piety. According to Jefferson, rulers who act differently and coerce their subjects are impious. It does not matter whether they are civil rulers or religious rulers. Neither have the right to impose their beliefs on others. For Jefferson, neither church nor state can use physical punishment, torture, or other forms of coercion to enforce belief. Next, Jefferson argued that taxes to support any religious denomination were a form of coercion. He called such taxes sinful and tyrannical. Still using Christian language to explain the foundation of religious liberty and the separation of church and state, the Baptist petitions and memorials had also called such taxes sinful and tyrannical. Jefferson explained that the civil government should only use its power to punish overt acts against peace and good order. It should never punish ideas, beliefs, or opinions. Civil government can deal only with outward conduct, not with hearts and minds. This is the strain of thought which evolved out of the Protestant Reformation. Jefferson also insisted that people should not lose their civil rights simply because their religious views are out of step with the government's. When we look for the roots of religious liberty in Virginia, we find that they are Christian. Though differing sharply from the British and medieval tradition, the political activism that led to religious liberty was initiated by Christians, and the arguments and principles were Christian as well. In light of these facts, it is completely reasonable to conclude that Virginia's very first law declaring religious liberty was founded on Christian core beliefs and supported by an explicitly Christian rationale. 10.8 Religious taxes. For religious liberty to become a reality in Virginia, the struggle against religious taxes and assessments had to be won. Jefferson's bill became the rallying cry for dissenters opposed to religious taxes. His opponents, however, stymied the bill in the legislature. Legislators refused to put the bill to vote. This encouraged voters to elect more delegates who supported religious freedom. As a result, the makeup of the legislature began to change. Finally, Jefferson's opponents decided to force the issue by proposing a new law instituting religious taxes and assessments. Passing such a law would have contradicted the Virginia Constitution, nullifying the clear meaning of Section 16. The following bill was proposed on November 11, 1784. That the people of this Commonwealth, according to their respective abilities, ought to pay a moderate tax or contribution annually for the support of the Christian religion, or some Christian church, denomination, or communion of Christians, or some form of Christian worship. All eyes were on Virginia to see how this event would unfold. Would Virginia break with the customs and traditions of its royalist past? British culture, traditions, customs, and outlook were strongest in Virginia. Even after independence, Virginia was more thoroughly British in culture and outlook than other states. It was not at all clear that Virginia would take a firm stand for religious liberty. How Virginia decided this issue would profoundly affect the rest of the nation. Virginia was the largest state in America. At the time, West Virginia, Kentucky, and the Northwest Territories were still part of Virginia. 5 states were later carved from the Northwest Territories. When Jefferson was governor of Virginia in 1799, he ruled a state whose territory was 1.5 times the size of California. New York was only 1/5 the size of Virginia. Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New Hampshire were each slightly larger than 3% of the size of Virginia. Rhode Island was slightly larger than some Virginia counties. The controversy in Virginia over religious taxes did not happen in a vacuum. The years between 1768 and 1774 were a time of religious persecution in Virginia. The King of England was furious after the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. He believed that religious dissenters in the colonies, particularly the Presbyterians, were most responsible for the colony's resistance to his policies. The king retaliated by implementing measures that led to religious persecution in Virginia. Despite British laws about toleration, even Presbyterians were persecuted for not conforming to the state-established religion. From 1768 to 1776, therefore, Presbyterian dissenters were just as vocal as the British Baptists in calling for complete religious liberty. Both were extremely pleased when the Virginia Constitution of 1776 called for religious liberty. By the early 1780s, however, the persecution had stopped, and the colonies had gained the upper hand over England. Instead of siding with Jefferson's bill, many of the Virginia Presbyterians flip-flopped. They stopped demanding complete religious liberty. Now they wanted the state to fund the Presbyterian Church with tax money, just as it had funded the Anglican Church. The coalition of Baptists and Presbyterians collapsed. After 1779, a number of Presbyterians began sending petitions and memorials to the legislature that supported religious tax. They wanted to disestablish the Anglican Church so that it no longer Virginia's official church. In its place, they wanted the Presbyterian Church to become the established church. The Religious Assessments Bill, which called for raising taxes to support Christian churches in Virginia, diametrically opposed Jefferson's bill. It is ironic that an obscure contest over a tax bill should mark such an important milestone for religious liberty. 10.9 James Madison's reply. The Memorial and Remonstrance. Madison did not wait for his Baptist friends to ask for his help. He was ready to fight the Religious Assessments Bill as soon as he learned that it had been introduced. Madison conceived a brilliant strategy. He would write an anonymous tract against the bill. Then he would work through his dissenting friends to conduct a statewide petition drive against the bill in favor of Jefferson's bill, which was still tabled. If he succeeded, he would not only defeat the tax bill, but also obtain the passage of Jefferson's bill. While the tax bill was being distributed to the counties, Madison wrote a memorial and remonstrance on the religious rights of man. It immediately took its place with the most important documents ever written on religious liberty. Its effect was phenomenal. Madison's argument was so compelling, especially when read side by side with the tax bill, that even Anglicans began writing the legislature demanding that the tax bill be withdrawn. The Virginia Presbyterians also swung behind Jefferson's bill. They wrote the legislature demanding that Jefferson's bill be passed instead of the tax bill. The Baptists, of course, were elated. Enshrined in Madison's memorial and remonstrance were the very arguments that Baptist dissenters had been making since they first fled English persecution of 1593. Madison's principles were the same ones that had cost the lives of the Baptist movement's founders. These were the principles for which the Baptists had suffered 170 years of persecution. Madison's principles were identical, for example, with those of Reverend John Smythe, one of the first Baptists. Smythe was expelled from the Anglican clergy for asserting that King James I had no authority over religion, the church, or people's hearts and minds. Smythe stated that illegal church of separatists. In 1608, he and the church fled to Amsterdam, Holland. There he published his Baptist views about separating church and state. Smythe's writings were among the first in the English language advocating full religious liberty. Smythe died of consumption in 1612. His replacement, Thomas Halley's return to England to spread the Baptist message. He wrote a book explaining his views on the separation of church and state. When he gave a copy to the king, he was immediately arrested and placed in the notorious Newgate prison, where he died in 1616. Halley's death began a string of martyrdoms for the Baptist cause. He died for preaching and believing what was the cornerstone of the 1612 London Confession, that the magistrate is not by virtue of his office to meddle with religion or with matters of conscience, to force or compel men to this or that form of religion or doctrine, but to leave the Christian religion free to every man's conscience, and to handle only civil transgressions, injuries, and wrongs against men, for Christ only is the king and lawgiver of the church and conscience. Madison began his remonstrance by citing Section 16 of the Virginia Constitution. Since the Virginia Constitution was the highest law of the state, any legislation contrary to it would be unconstitutional. According to Madison, the Virginia Constitution recognized God's claims on people and the people's duties towards God. Since the religious tax bill violated both God's claim on people and the state's constitution, it was doubly wrong. Madison defined religion as a duty owed to our Creator. Religion was therefore not a duty owed to the government. This meant that if the government passed laws to control religion, government was putting itself in the place of God and committing idolatry. The supporters of the tax bill thought that they were promoting Christianity. According to Madison, they were really violating the first commandment, which said, "Thou shalt not have any other gods before me." This duty to God, Madison argued, existed before government existed, and was therefore higher than any duty to the state. Sincere religious people were duty-bound to disobey the government if it made itself higher than God. For Madison, people must always view themselves first and foremost as subjects to the governor of the universe. This meant that a person's earthly citizenship and civil duties were always secondary to God's requirements. It also meant that when a government came into existence, there were certain claims that it could not make on anyone. Government was barred from making any claim on complete control religion. According to Madison, religion belonged completely to God and was completely outside of any earthly authority. We maintain, therefore, that in matters of religion no man's rights is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance. Society could not control a person's religion because religion was a personal duty between an individual and God. The community had nothing to do with it. Therefore, religion was wholly exempt from society's cognizance. Madison went on to explain that since religion was exempt from society at large, it was also exempt from the government because governments were formed by society. But if religion be exempt from the authority of the society at large, still less can it be subject to that of the legislative body. The latter are but the creatures and vicegerents of the former. Their jurisdiction is both derivative and limited. Madison then insisted that Christianity, as originally conceived, did not include the merger of church and state. Authentic Christianity had no place for government involvement in religion. He urged that if a law about religion must be passed, it should purpose a restoration of this primitive state in which its, Christianity's, teachers depended on the voluntary rewards of their flocks. Reflecting on the history of Christianity, Madison wrote, "During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less in all places pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Inquire of the teachers of Christianity for the ages in which it appeared it is greatest lustre. Those of every sect point to the ages prior to its incorporation with civil policy." Madison concluded that authentic Christianity forbids merging church and state. Madison's points was not lost on his predominantly Protestant audience. Protestants were accustomed to arguing with the Catholic Church, and had been wrong for mixing government and religion. In the Remonstrance, Madison scolded Protestants for doing the same thing. Memorial and Remonstrance, James Madison. To the Honorable, the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we, the subscribers, citizens of the said Commonwealth, having taken into serious consideration a bill printed by order of the last session of General Assembly entitled "A Bill Establishing a Provision for Teachers of the Christian Religion," and conceiving that the same, if finally armed with the sanctions of a law, will be dangerous abuse of power, are bound, as faithful members of a free state, to remonstrate against it, and to declare the reasons by which we are determined. We remonstrate against the said bill. 1. Because we hold it for a fundamental and undeniable truth that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. It is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an unalienable right. It is unalienable because the opinions of men, depending only on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot follow the dictates of other men. It is unalienable also because what is here a right towards man is a duty towards the Creator. It is the duty of every man to render to the Creator such homage and such only as he believes to be acceptable to him. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. Before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. And if a member of civil society do it with the savings of his allegiance to the universal sovereign, we maintain, therefore, that in matters of religion no man's right is abridged by the institution of civil society, and that religion is wholly exempt from its cognizance. True it is that no other rule exists by which any question which may divide a society can be ultimately determined, but the will of the majority. But it is also true that the majority may trespass on the rights of the minority. Number 2. Because religion be exempt from the authority of the society at large, still less can it be subject to that of the legislative body. The latter are but the creatures and vicegerents of the former. Their jurisdiction is both derivative and limited. It is limited with regard to the coordinate departments; more necessarily it is limited with regard to the constituents. The preservation of a free government requires not merely that the metes and bounds which separate each department of power be invariably maintained, but more especially that neither of them be suffered to overleap the great barrier which defends the rights of the people. The rulers who are guilty of such an encroachment exceed the commission from which they derive their authority, and are tyrants. The people who submit to it are governed by law made neither by themselves nor by authority derived from them, and are slaves. Number 3. Because it is proper to take alarm at the first experiment of our liberties, we hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens, and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution. The free men of America did not wait till usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise, and entangled the question in precedents. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle. We revere this lesson too much soon to forget it. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity, in exclusion of all other religions, may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians, in exclusion of all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever. Number 4. Because the bill violates the equality which ought to be the basis of every law, and which is more indispensable, in proportion as the validity or expediency of any law is more liable to be impeached. If all men are by nature equally free and independent, all men are to be considered as entering into society on equal conditions, as relinquishing no more, and therefore retaining no less, one than another of their natural rights. Above all, they are to be considered as retaining an equal title to their free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Whilst we assert for ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion which we believe to be the divine origin, we cannot deny an equal freedom to those whose minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. If this freedom be abused, it is an offense against God, not against man. To God, therefore, not to man, must an account of it be rendered. As the bill violates equality by subjecting some to particular burdens, so it violates the same principle by granting to others particular exemptions. Are the Quakers and Mennonites the only sects who think of compulsive support of their religions unnecessary and unwarrantable? Can their piety alone be entrusted with the care of public worship? Ought their religions to be endowed above all others with extraordinary privileges by which proselytes may be enticed from all others? We think too favorably of the justice and good sense of these denominations to believe that they either covet preeminences over their fellow citizens, or that they will be seduced by them from the common opposition to the measure. Number 5. Because the bill implies either that the civil magistrate is a competent judge of religious truth, or that he may employ religion as an engine of civil policy. The first is an arrogant pretension falsified by the contradictory opinions of the rulers in all ages, and throughout the world. The second, an unhallowed perversion of the means of salvation. Number 6. Because the establishment proposed by the bill is not requisite for the support of the Christian religion, to say that it is a contradiction to the Christian religion itself, for every page of it disavows a dependence on the powers of this world. It is a contradiction to fact, for it is known that this religion both existed and flourished not only without the support of human laws, but in spite of every opposition from them, and not only during the period of miraculous aid, but long after it had been left to its own evidence and the ordinary care of Providence. Nay, it is a contradiction in terms for a religion not invented by human policies, but have pre-existed and have been supported before it was established by human policy. It is moreover to weaken in those who profess this religion a pious confidence in its innate excellence and the patronage of its author, and to foster in those who still reject it a suspicion that its friends are too conscious of its fallacies to treat it to its own merits. Number 7. Because experience witnesseth that ecclesiastical establishments, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation. During most 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less, in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Inquire of the teachers of Christianity for the ages in which it appeared in its greatest luster. Those of every sect point to the ages prior to its incorporation with civil policy. Propose a restoration of this primitive state in which its teachers depended on the voluntary rewards of their flocks. Many of them predict its downfall. On which side ought their testimony to have greatest weight? When for or when against their interest? Number 11. Because it will destroy the moderation and harmony which the forbearance of our laws to intermeddle with religion has produced among its several sects. Torrents of blood have been spilt in the Old World by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord by proscribing all difference in religious opinion. Time has at length revealed the true remedy. Every relaxation of narrow and rigorous policy, wherever it has been tried, has been found to assuage the disease. 15. Because finally, the equal right of every citizen to the free exercise of his religion according to the dictates of conscience is held by the same tenure with all our other rights. According to Madison, the Baptist, Quakers, moderate Presbyterians, and other dissenters had been right all along about not merging church and state. Religious liberty was the only correct principle, and it alone has authentically Christian. Now was the time for the people of Virginia and the legislature to recognize that they had not been following Christianity as it was originally conceived. 10.10 Madison's Impact. The impact of Madison's remonstrance in the counties was staggering. When the legislature convened, the volume of petitions had grown so large that the tax bill was not even put to a vote. One of the activists who had gathered signatures in the petition drive was Jeremiah Moore, a Baptist pastor who had been imprisoned for preaching. He and others put at least 10,000 signatures into Jefferson's hands. Some placed the number as high as 15,000. Such numbers were huge in a day when the entire colonial population was only around 2 million. The legislature, which was still largely dominated by Anglicans, convened at October 17, 1785. When the tax bill came up for consideration, it failed in the committee of the whole by only 3 votes. Without Madison's remonstrance and the signatures it generated, the tax bill would surely have passed in the committee. Most likely it would then have passed in the Assembly as well. Instead, the tax bill was defeated. After its defeat, Madison reintroduced Jefferson's Bill for Religious Liberty. That bill finally passed on December 17, 1785. Jefferson's Bill for Religious Liberty, written in 1779, was not signed into law until January of 1786. It remains law in Virginia today, and Madison's Section 16 is still part of the Virginia Constitution. The defeat of the tax bill marked a turning point not only for Virginia, but also for America as a whole. 10.11 Contemporary Views. It has become popular recently to argue that Christianity has little to do with America's founding. Many believe, for instance, that Jefferson and Madison's view on separation were based on a personal hostility toward Christianity. In other words, the purpose of separating church and state was to keep religious people out of politics. Many have also begun to doubt that there was ever a Christian rationale for separating church and state, to say nothing of Jefferson and Madison adopting such a rationale. This chapter was examined three turning points documents in the history of religious liberty and separation of church and state. First, we looked at Section 16 of the Virginia Constitution, which Madison helped to write. Next, we looked at Virginia's Bill for Religious Liberty, which provided concrete means for enforcing Section 16. And finally, we examined Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, which argued for religious liberty and against government control of religion. In all three instances, we found that Madison and Jefferson argued from explicitly Christian premises to defend religious liberty and deny the government control over religion. This fact is particularly striking where Jefferson is concerned. Personally, he did not believe that Jesus was divine. In his religious liberty bill, however, his arguments were completely in harmony with the Baptist and moderate Presbyterian view of religious liberty. In fact, it appears that he drew his arguments directly from those sources. Rather than arguing as an opponent of Christianity, Jefferson openly adopted the legal arguments of dissenting Protestants. There's a simple reason why Jefferson could comfortably use the term wall of separation. When writing to the Danbury Baptists in 1802, the term was not an attack on Christianity or Christian principles. Indeed, Jefferson knew that his Baptist friends would immediately recognize that the term was consistent with Baptist principles. Their demonstration had been preaching the separation of church and state for 200 years. Baptists were demanding such a separation long before Jefferson and Madison were born. Now, their hard-fought principle was in Virginia Constitution. From there, it entered the federal Constitution as the First Amendment. The Bill of Rights, passed by Congress September 25, 1789, ratified December 15, 1791. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment 2. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment 3. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Amendment 4. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon portable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons of things to be seized. Number 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life and limb. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or prosperity without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Amendment 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. Amendment number 7. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Amendment 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Amendment 9. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And Amendment 10. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the States, are reserved to the States respectively or to the people. 10.12 Conclusion. It was in the American colonies that the dangers of allowing government control of religion came fully to light. Ending that government control of religion in Virginia and subsequently in the United States was a remarkable achievement. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison displayed exceptional leadership, demonstrating that government's control of religion, which had gone on for so long, was fundamentally wrong. Without their insight and vision, success would have been unlikely. It's important to recognize, however, that the idea was not new with them, but they were in the right place at the right time with the right training, tools, and support to transform the vision of religious liberty into reality. Moreover, they drew their ideas about religious liberty and separation of church and state from Christian sources. Martin Luther had called for religious liberty and for the separation of church and state at the very start of the Protestant Reformation. Madison, the former divinity student of Princeton, the father of the Constitution, and the principal author of the First Amendment, explicitly credited Martin Luther with leading the way toward a separation of church and state. Dissenting Puritans, calling themselves Baptists, made it a centerpiece of their movement in England and America beginning in the early 1600s. We end, therefore, where we began, with the Creator-Redeemer distinction leading to Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, culminating in the formal separation of church and state in the United States. Like so many other religious origins of American ideals, the Christian roots of the separation of church and state have been largely forgotten and overlooked. American constitutionalism, American education, American nomenclature, American law, and a multitude of other American institutions trace their foundations to religion. Like Madison, most of the founders of the United States were deeply grounded in Christian theology. Their theological principles permeated every aspect of their lives and in turn have permeated American history, culture, and politics ever since. Ironically, some use the Protestant principle of separation of church and state in an attempt to prevent educators from telling the truth about its origin. For a public school teacher to teach the religious genesis of our national ideals is wrongly alleged by some to be a violation of the Constitution. What this volume has demonstrated clearly is that to deny the religious genesis of our nation is to be intellectually and historically dishonest. Perhaps some now in the arena, or even a student of history studying this book, will one day make a decisive contribution towards restoring the balance originally envisioned by the nation's founders.